Hey there, warriors and history buffs! Welcome back to another episode of All About War. In today's episode, we'll be talking about one of the most significant events in Viking history, the Siege of Paris in 845. But before we dive into the siege, let's set the stage. It's the 9th century, and Europe is in a bit of a tizzy. After the fall of the Roman Empire, different kingdoms and empires rose to power, each vying for control over land and resources. In addition to this political chaos, there were also various invasions and migrations taking place, which further destabilized the region. One such invasion was the Viking Age, which began in the late 8th century. The Vikings were fierce warriors from Scandinavia who were known for their seafaring skills, trade, and raiding. They would sail across the seas and raid coastal towns, monasteries, and even cities. And they weren't afraid to travel inland to plunder and pillage either. The Vikings' raids and invasions had a significant impact on Europe. They not only caused physical damage to buildings and communities, but they also left a lasting impression on the psyche of the people. They were seen as barbarians and heathens who were out to destroy everything that was good and civilized. This led to a fear of the unknown and a desire to protect oneself from outside threats. In response to the Viking raids, many kingdoms and empires began to fortify their cities and towns. They built walls, fortresses, and castles to protect themselves from invasion. They also formed armies and hired mercenaries to defend their territories. It was like a game of medieval whack-a-mole, where you had to defend against unexpected attacks from different directions. The Viking Age also had a significant impact on trade and commerce. The Vikings were skilled traders and sailors who established trade routes across the seas. They traded goods such as furs, timber, and metals, and they also established trading posts and settlements in various parts of Europe. This led to a flourishing of trade and commerce, but it also meant that the Vikings had access to information about potential targets for raiding. Overall, the context of the 9th century was one of political and social upheaval, invasions and migrations, and fear of outside threats. The Vikings were one of the major players in this context, and their raids and conquests left a lasting impression on European history. Now, on to the siege itself. Who came up with the idea to attack Paris, you ask? Well, it was none other than the infamous Viking leader, Ragnar Lodbrok. Ragnar was a legendary figure in Viking history and was known for his military prowess and cunning tactics. He was like the Vikings' version of Alexander the Great, except with better hair. As for why he wanted to target Paris, there are a few theories. Some say he wanted to make a name for himself and prove that Vikings were the best warriors of their time. Others say he was after the riches and resources that the city had to offer, and some even say he was just really bored and needed a new challenge. Regardless of the reason, Ragnar and his fleet of ships set sail for Paris in the spring of 845. They had around 120 ships and an estimated 5,000 warriors. It was like a Viking version of Noah's Ark, except with a lot more axes and shields. Now, let's talk about the leaders on each side. On the Viking side, we have the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, a man who was so tough he could probably bench press a longship. Ragnar was a skilled warrior and tactician who was feared by many. He was like a Viking version of Genghis Khan, except with better fashion sense. On the Parisian side, we have Charles the Bald. Charles was the king of the Franks and ruled over a large part of what is now France. He was a descendant of Charlemagne and had a lot to live up to. Unfortunately, he didn't inherit his ancestors' great hair. It was more like a balding version of a mullet. Before the siege began, the Vikings had to prepare themselves. They knew they were up against a heavily fortified city with strong walls and defenses. So, they had to come up with some new tactics and weapons to give them an edge. They gathered their fleet and warriors and set sail for Paris. They also had to navigate the Seine River, which was no easy feat. It was like trying to drive a car down a one-lane road during rush hour. Now, on to the siege itself. What made this siege unique? Well, for starters, the Vikings brought some new weapons and tactics to the table. They had battering rams, siege towers, and even used a technique called a shield wall to protect themselves. The shield wall was like a human fortress that could move around and attack. It was like a real-life version of the video game Fortnite. But despite their best efforts, the Vikings were unable to breach the walls of Paris. So they decided to change tactics. They sailed up the Seine River and attacked the city from the inside. It was like trying to sneak into a movie theater without paying, except with a lot more axes and blood. But how did the siege end, you ask? Well, after some intense fighting and negotiating, the Vikings were paid a hefty ransom to leave Paris alone. The Parisians gave them 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, which was a fortune in those days. It was like a really expensive game of let's make a deal. The siege had a significant impact on both Paris and the Frankish kingdom. It was a wake-up call for the Franks and made them realize that they needed to invest in better defenses and fortifications. It was like a medieval version of home improvement, where you invest in better security systems to protect yourself from burglars. Subsequent Viking raids in the region continued for many years. The Vikings even established a settlement in what is now Normandy, which became a major power in the region. It was like the Vikings were playing a really long game of Risk and were slowly taking over the board. The siege also had a significant impact on trade and commerce. After the siege, the Vikings continued to establish trade routes throughout Europe and establish settlements in various parts of the continent. This led to the development of new markets and economic opportunities, which helped to fuel the growth of many European cities and towns. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Siege of Paris was its impact on European identity and culture. The siege was a traumatic event for many Europeans, and it led to a deep-seated fear of the Vikings and other outside threats. It also contributed to the development of a distinct European identity and culture, which was based on a shared history of conflict and conquest. The legacy of the Siege of Paris can still be felt today, not only in Europe but also in popular culture. The siege has been depicted in numerous movies, TV shows, and books, and it continues to capture the imagination of people around the world. It has become a symbol of the Viking Age and a testament to the enduring power of human conflict and conquest. And there you have it, warriors and history buffs, the Siege of Paris in all its glory. We hope you enjoyed this episode of All About War. This event serves as a reminder of the power of human conflict and conquest, and how it has shaped our world throughout history. The Siege of Paris is just one example of the many battles, wars, and conquests that have taken place throughout history. Each one has its own unique story, filled with heroes and villains, triumphs and tragedies. By learning about these events, we can gain a deeper understanding of the human experience and the complex web of factors that shape our world. So, whether you're a student, a history buff, or just someone who loves a good story, we hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Until then, keep fighting the good fight.